I'm Tyler Harris, and you're listening to the Nebraska Notebook. This week, we're visiting with Mike Baker, owner and operator of Baker's Acres in Trenton, Nebraska. He's also vice chairman of the state sorghum checkoff board. And today, we're talking about sorghum, which has been increasing in popularity in Nebraska in recent years, particularly last year when sorghum saw a huge increase in acres. About 22.4% nationally was the increase. And Mike, when we had visited last winter, we talked about treating sorghum like a high priority crop. What needs to go into sorghum to make it a high priority crop, or to put sorghum first, I guess?
You just have to put the effort and time into it to look at it. Of all aspects of growing, as a high profiting, high yielding crop is fertility, weed control, pest management. All those are very important aspects to look at.
Well, we talked about pest management and how that plays a very integral role. Why is that such a challenge in sorghum, and why is it such a priority for you, and what all does your program involve?
As far as the pest management goes, we live not too far from the state line here in Kansas, but you get a few miles south of this I-70 is kind of the corridor for where the sugarcane aphid was this year. And we really hope and pray that we don't have to deal with that. Much as I like my neighbors to the south, they can kind of keep that down there and farther south. And I've talked to some people, seen some results of what the sugarcane aphid can do, and we really don't want to have to deal with that up here.
Yeah, it's kind of a pretty nasty problem and slows down harvest, and I imagine it affects grain quality as well. You just drive by some of those fields and see the honeydew sticking to it. It doesn't look pretty. So
yep, and there are those few pesticides that are labeled for sorghum to kill the sugarcane aphid. Lower commodity prices right now, you really don't have to spend any more money than you would have to.
Yeah, and that's an ongoing challenge for a lot of producers, but I suspect that will also, that might be a catalyst to draw more producers to grow sorghum, wouldn't you say, or would that not be the case?
Oh, I think, this year was not near as large an issue as it was last year, and the plant breeders right now are actually trying to breed for the resistance against the sugarcane aphid.
Yeah.
So hopefully a few years from now, it's not even an issue to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also seeing a lot of genetics coming down the line in terms of ALS resistance. There are some opportunities for the herbicide treatments as well. But on the herbicide side and weed control, how important of a role does that play in raising a good sorghum crop?
The weed control issue is probably one of the foremost issues we have for growing this area. I generally tell people you're going to get out of the crop what you put into it, speaking about herbicides. If you don't think you're going to spend much money on it and you're going to do a low-cost herbicide program, you're going to be very disappointed with the results. You really have to, much as I hate to say it, buy the top-name programs or the products and spend the money, and you'll be really happy with the results.
Yeah. So what does your herbicide program typically involve? I mean, I imagine a fall burn down is probably pretty high priority.
Yep, you always want to start with a clean slate. We're always planting to wheat stubble, and apply atrazine late as possible. This year, the rate we're going right now, it might be December before I put any atrazine down. Then that always carries me through till planting time for sorghum. I never do go into it until after I plant it. And then right before emergence, I always like to put down a program. Of course, your burn down, your standards, and then for residuals, your high dollar products, you want to run like a Verdict or a Lumax blend, and either one of those two products has been very rewarding for me.
Yeah, and of course, since we're talking about sorghum, controlling those weeds up front is going to be very critical in producing a good crop. And moving on towards the fertility side, Mike, that's something else we talked about today. How important is that, and how much of a difference can it make to make sure that you've got your fertilizer program right when you're shooting for higher yields in sorghum?
Well, it's always paramount and important that for my aspect, I like to pull soil samples. I always like to go out in the fall and see what next year's crop's going to require, and that way you get a rough idea what you're going to need for next year. And you can have a starting slate, whether you spread dry in the spring or liquid fertilizer, whatever your program is, you at least know, and you can always plug in your yield goals and what you expect to do.
Yeah, it's kind of a matter of you can't manage what you don't measure. And one of the things that you had mentioned to me today was you want to fertilize your sorghum about like you would corn, right?
Yep, that's correct. I always figure if you weren't going to pull soil samples, I'd always put down a pound of N for every bushel expected to yield. It's just a good rule of thumb, and you won't go wrong with that.
Yeah, and I mean, in a lot of cases, we've seen dryland sorghum and irrigated probably, not that far beneath what corn is hitting around here, right? So
this year, I was especially tickled pink. I host the Nebraska Producers Association plot, and I said we cracked the 150 bushel per acre mark, which was huge for me. Last year we were at 149. This year we were 152 was a top leading hybrid, and I'm just real happy to show people on my farm that we're capable of having those kind of dry land yields.
We also talked about hybrid selection in sorghum, and I also wanted to touch base with you on that, on how important of a role that plays, in making sure that you get the most out of your inputs in selecting the right hybrid.
Our limiting factor here, I guess, is maybe like they're always an early winter. I always like to spread out my hybrids. I like to have a fair amount of short season hybrids, and I'll plant a few hybrids that are fuller season. They're going to have a little more bang for your buck, but those fuller season hybrids honestly will out yield the shorter ones, 20 or 30 bushels per acre. But then you start playing with the cards and how they're dealt, and you might have an early snow, early freeze that kills the crop before it finishes. It's what you want at it. I'd rather have the crop in the bin and all done before snow flies.
And that all goes back to knowing what your conditions are in your situation. I mean, folks here are going to have it a little bit different than the folks down in the Texas Panhandle, for example. It's all about your location, your soil type, and knowing your farm. And it certainly made a difference here. You mentioned, at the yield plot tour this year that you saw 150 bushels, and that was on par with a lot of the dryland corn acres in the area. And we mentioned earlier how acres were kind of on the rise here last year in 2015, and that was due to, what was it, about a dollar premium that they were earning over corn prices per bushel. Do you think we're continuing to see that increase? And if not, then what needs to happen to increase sorghum acres or get more growers interested in sorghum?
2 years ago was definitely an anomaly what happened. I mean, China's came in, and it was a great problem to have, and it maybe opened some eyes that, the demand is there and people want it foreignly and domestically as a good food crop. Of course, then what happens the next following year, everybody plants a lot more acres, and what do we have? We have a surplus in supply. The demand is still there from China, and Mexico is back in the market, and a few other major international players are back in the market. It's just the fact that we grew so much in 1 year, and hopefully we find a happy medium here somewhere.
All right, and next we're going to continue the sorghum conversation with Del Fike, who's going to be joining us on the phone. Del is the owner of Fike Cattle Company and Graze Master Genetics just west of Lincoln near Pleasantdale, and as a member of the current national leadership sorghum class, Del brings a unique perspective to the sorghum world from the standpoint of a grazier. And Del, you've been grazing sorghum for a long time, right? I wanted to ask you about how you fit sorghum into your rotation.
Well, we also, grow it for grain purposes that we feed our animals that run through our meat program. We've used milo or sorghum for, I think since the 50s when my dad started using it in his feedlot operation. But the sorghum sedan, is what everyone goes to and thinks about with the great grazing. And I'm a big believer in the sorghum sedan, the height, the good grain qualities, all that, great soil armor, things like that. But what we've been doing the last few years is, in a lot of our cover crop mixes or rotations, we're putting regular milo or sorghum, the grain type, in there, and it's just worked out great. We've seen, really good gains. We're building the soil with that, the channels that particular crop puts, down through the soil, and we use milo or sorghum for just about everything that people maybe haven't thought of. And the grazing is a huge part, the wildlife side, putting it in some of those low spots, for the animals, and we just leave it. The cows may hit it eventually, but it's a really good kept secret for grazing.
Yes, that's true. And a lot of that has to do with the sugar content, right? I mean, we've talked about the soil health benefits, but then there's a huge benefit to all that sugar content in the stock. And then, of course, there are forage sorghum varieties, which are a little bit taller, that have even more of that sugar content, right?
Exactly. And, we'd love to graze sorghum stalks, after you harvest it with the combine. We'd love to do that. It's better than corn stalks, things like that. But one of the things that I have learned through this national leadership program is when I was in Texas a couple months ago, and I got to see, where 85% of the sorghum is raised and researched, basically for, the United States. We got to go on those research farms and see what they're doing, and they're doing some really cool things. They're looking at some BMR type varieties. You can harvest the grain the cattle are going to come in there, and they're going to love that stock. So all of a sudden you have not residue or stalks per se to graze, you have feed, you have value in it. And so maybe people that are thinking about other options using sorghum back into their grain rotation, you may just add some value into those stocks for people grazing them if they don't have their own cattle.
Exactly. It's truly turning sorghum into two crops there. You have the first crop for grain, and then you have the second crop, which truly allows you to expand the AUMs that you can graze during the winter months if you so choose. And not everybody uses corn stalks like they should, just because there are some common misconceptions surrounding grazing corn stalks, I think, out there, and that's probably more so in Iowa than it is in Nebraska. But there's less and less because we've gotten so efficient in terms of harvesting that corn, and because we've bred it to put more energy into the grain, that there just isn't as much nutritional value as there used to be in those stocks.
And that's right.
Yeah.
You know, that when we go in and we drill our sorghum to harvest for grain, that drilled stock aftermath is unbelievable for grazing. The other day when we got the 4 or 5 inches of snow out of nowhere, no one else seemed to get it, we moved some cattle off of some shorter cover crops briefly into milo stocks, that were standing above the snow yet, and they loved it. I mean, they were clipping the tops of those stalks off, so we knew there was some sugar, we knew there was some feed value in there because they weren't really even attempting to go after, the leaves. So, it's amazing what's happening out there. Richardson Seed Farms in Vega, Texas is working on a BMR short season sorghum, so you can harvest it. You can harvest it early. You can turn cattle in there quickly, whatever you want to do, and then you can get your cover crops in there. So you're, shortening those days and still having a really good crop. Adding value to your operation through grazing, through potentially selling that sorghum into different markets like food. Everybody talks about feed and fuel. We have to think about sorghum as, what's the possibilities of actually eating this, and the culinary people are coming around that now, and it's becoming quite popular.
Oh, absolutely. That's true, yeah. And you mentioned short season varieties, and that becomes even more important the further north we go. I mean, and we talk about some of this research, and one of the things I hear discussed in the northern panhandle, for example, because it's a cold steppe climate, they have a strong temperature swings between night and day, and the challenge for them for growing sorghum in general is just that it gets so cold at night. And I could see where a shorter season variety would help mitigate that to a certain extent, where you can grow sorghum in those colder climates like that.
And another cool thing too, Tyler, is the USDA facility in Lubbock, Texas was just something else that blew me away. And you and I have talked about this in the past, but what they're doing with, putting the cold genes into some of this milo so you can get it in earlier, it's going to come up, it's going to stand those cold nights better. Sorghum likes the ground to be pretty warm, and that's a drawback for a lot of people who want to get it done. Yep. So, it's amazing that only 3% of the world's sorghum genetics have been utilized.
Oh, wow.
That's mind-blowing. They're really having to be creative now, developing corn and different strains. When I was in Lubbock, I got to see some milo that was 20 foot tall, some sorghum that was 20 foot tall.
Oh, wow.
And so it blew my mind, because as a cow guy, as a grazer, as somebody that wants that soil armor, I saw immediately feed value trump the rest and have that, that great cover and get, the water infiltrating better and stuff like that. But what they were using that particular variety for was just the cold gene that they were putting into some of these shorter seasons, and that's all public. That's all public varieties down there. So, I can call them and say, hey, could you send me up, a couple bags to try in a test plot? And I think it's one of the few places that it's really a public deal.
And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the cold gene. That's really interesting, because we know sorghum is essentially, it's a tropical adapted crop. It came from these tropical regions of the world, and we know it's water use efficient too. We know that those are some of the benefits that have been touted quite often, and to really get it to work into some of these colder desert or cold steppe climates like we have in the northwestern part of the high plains, I mean, that's what it's going to take. In those areas where they are water limited, like the northwestern panhandle, for example, in Box Butte County, that would be a significant benefit towards expanding sorghum's acres north of I-80.
Sure. That's been, water's going to be limited down the road. I mean, if you're irrigating, 10 years from now is going to look a lot different. Not in 9.5 years should you be thinking about different crops or what are your options. You should be looking at them now. To see what's going to be there, because you and I are both aware of how it's all changing, and we're going to be raising different crops here in 10 years. Some of them we've raised in the past. Some of them are going to be crops that we haven't ever heard of.
Exactly.
So
a lot of that goes back to the concept of resiliency that we keep hearing talking about. And UNL has talked about, their exhibit at Husker Harvest Days last year was Weather Ready Farms. It's weathering extremes and just the extreme variability that we've seen in the climate. And this is one of those tools that can be in growers' pockets to remain dynamic and resilient in the wake of these volatile times. And not just volatile in terms of weather, but also in terms of economics, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's, we have to stop thinking about a monoculture type deal. You hit the nail on the head with the diversity in everything. The good Lord didn't put just one species. When he started this, the earth, it was multiple. It was millions of different things: insects, plants, animals. And we just really went away from that. And so sorghum fits in ideally to that. Hey, let's start maybe taking a step back and thinking about how that used to work. But then let's think about, hey, there's a lot of cool things. It's not the same old sorghum that Grandpa used to raise.
Yep, it's not your grandpa's sorghum crop, exactly. And you made a really good analogy earlier, Del, about using sorghum as a good armor for the soil. To me, that's a great compliment to how sorghum can be beneficial to grazing, because you and I have talked in the past about how if you graze sorghum at the right time or get it seeded at the right time, then you can graze it multiple times and keep that sorghum armored, or that soil armored rather, by just through cattle traffic, from grazing it up to 4 times a year, I've heard, in the growing season, and trampling those stalks, that residue, into the soil. I mean, what are some of those steps that need to be taken to do that, and have you seen similar results?
Absolutely. Both my grandfathers, I remember as a kid, they always had these patches of Sudan or forage sorghum, something, it got tall, whatever. They called it Sudex, that was one of the old names they called it. They did it a little different. They let it get pretty tall and mature before they turned the cows out. What I do is I let it get about 1 foot to 2 foot tall, and I'll either ultra-high density graze it, go through with a lot of cows really fast, or we'll put it up for hay, and then we let that come back, and we like to let it get fairly mature, sometimes even let it freeze, in the fall, but it's going to have grain. It's going to be, I had some guys from Minnesota and Iowa at my place yesterday. They were looking at some of this Sudan or forage sorghum that we had standing there, and it's still 12 foot tall. It hasn't fallen over yet.
Wow.
And so... And when they were here at my place, a month or two ago, some of it was 15 foot tall. So my neighbors are like, why didn't you run cows to that little patch? Well, that was a highly erodible area. That field is great for water infiltration, things like that. But that particular area, the soil's a little thinner, things like that. And I've got to see firsthand the channels that sorghum Sudan or whatever kind of sorghum, regular Milo, it really has a nice set of channels for that water to go down, especially if you have a good earth population.
Oh, yeah.
And then last fall, we turned yearling heifers in sorghum that was 12 feet tall. And then we let them, chop that in, eat what they wanted. The armor that it put on the soil, with our soil being really balanced on that field, those stocks are almost gone the next spring.
Just because of the carbon cycling, or?
Right. Yeah. On that particular field where we've been doing this, starting out as a fluke, we needed cow feed 10 or 15 years ago. We started using all this stuff, then, intense cover crops, things like that. We have millions and millions of earthworms and, you know, activity in there.
So the infiltration, the organic matter content must just be off the charts on this particular field, I would imagine.
Oh, it is. I mean, I get to talk about it, you know, as I consult across the country. My dad was very forward-thinking and always, you know, tried to measure everything. We have records going back when he bought that particular farm in the 60s, but 10 years ago, the organic matter was 2.6, which was pretty high compared to the stuff that's around today. You know, most of it's 1.5%, 2% is going to get that organic matter in a lot of these fields. But 10 years ago, 2.6 to now 6.9 in a decade.
Oh my gosh, that's a huge, huge increase.
And what we did on that field, cover crops, spring and fall, we maybe had 1 or 2 crops of commodity stuff in there off the charts. Didn't think about it, you know, like 80 bushel beans on a dry year. And, you know, we didn't even think then maybe we're doing something right because we were just doing it for cow feed. But ultra high density grazing, putting a lot of animals across that. When NRCS came out last spring and did the water infiltration, 13.30 at that particular time. 13.3 inches in an hour.
That's incredible. And a lot of that, of course, is due to the introduced animal traffic, you know, going through there and grazing some of those annual crops, I would imagine, just by increasing the organic matter and improving the water holding capacity. So,
right. And, you know, I think you and I have talked about I'm big on looking at cow pies. You know, everybody thinks I'm pretty strange. I love the dung beetle. You know, it's back to our farm. It was gone for how many years? It's back to our farm now. But we're ultra-high-density grazing. We got a lot of those cow pies laying there. You know, they're not on top of each other by any means. You know, we're maybe getting 60 or 70% coverage. But you take a spade in between those, there's a lot of earthworms.
Yeah.
You take a spade under one of those, and it will blow your mind.
And, of course, sorghum has a pretty significant role to play there, right? Because that's, in addition to the organic matter content that's getting a boost from the manure content, and, of course, the cows love that stuff, that sorghum and the sorghum residue out there, but the sorghum is also a great way to get that carbon cycle going because there is such high-quality residue out there, and that also contributes to the overall organic matter and infiltration rate package in the long run.
It is my absolute go-to crop for building soil, you know, and covering that soil, and you can we put it on some really poor ground in the last few years, and we were able to see results, you know, that was in a cover crop mix, but results pretty fast. You know, you can see the change in the soil, how it looks, how it smells. It already starts to get that cottage cheese look, you know, that second or third year, but I am a firm believer in that's, you know, it's the sorghum part of it.
And you can learn more about sorghum's potential as grain and as a forage in upcoming print issues of Nebraska Farmer and online at nebraskafarmer.com. Be sure to follow us at Facebook at facebook.com/Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and thanks for listening to the Nebraska Notebook.